It was a snowy December evening when four friends Emma, Lucas, Sarah, and Jake decided to rent an old house in the countryside to celebrate Christmas. They wanted a change from the usual holiday chaos and hoped for a cozy, memorable getaway. Lucas found the listing online, charming historical home for rent, perfect for the holidays. The pictures showed a quaint Victorian house surrounded by snow-covered pines. It was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but they brushed it off. They were students, after all, and the price was perfect. They arrived on Christmas Eve. The house stood alone on a quiet road, its dark windows like watching eyes. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and something metallic. The walls were lined with antique portraits of unsmiling people, and the furniture creaked under the weight of time. Definitely creepy, but it has character, Jake joked, lighting the fireplace. The night began peacefully. They cooked dinner, exchanged gifts, and drank mulled wine. As the clock struck 11, Emma noticed something odd about one of the portraits. The man in it seemed to be looking directly at her. "Guys, am I crazy, or was he looking the other way earlier?" she asked, pointing at the painting. Lucas shrugged. "You're imagining things. It's just old and weird." But soon, Sarah chimed in. "No, she's right. Look at the woman in that one." She pointed to another painting, where a woman in a dark dress now seemed to have turned her head slightly toward the group. They laughed nervously, blaming the wine and their overactive imaginations. Yet unease began to creep in like the cold drafts that slipped through the house. Around midnight, Lucas suggested they play a game of hide and seek. Despite the eerie atmosphere, they agreed it was something to pass the time. Jake volunteered to be it, and counted to 50 while the others scattered. Emma hid in a large wardrobe upstairs, pressing herself against the back wall. She heard the floorboards creak as someone walked past. Thinking it was Jake, she stifled a giggle. But then the footsteps stopped right in front of the wardrobe. "Jake," she whispered. No answer. The door creaked open slightly, and she held her breath, expecting him to jump out and scare her. Instead, the door swung open to reveal nothing. The hallway was empty. Emma bolted downstairs, finding Lucas and Sarah already in the living room. "Where's Jake?" she asked, trembling. "He hasn't found us yet," Sarah replied. Moments later, Jake stumbled into the room, pale and shaking. I was in the basement," he stammered. "I thought I saw someone down there. But it wasn't one of you." They all froze. "What do you mean, someone?" Lucas demanded. "A man," Jake said. "Tall, wearing an old coat. I thought it was some weird antique mannequin, but then it moved." Deciding they'd had enough, they packed their things in a hurry, but when they tried to leave, the front door wouldn't budge. The locks turned, but the door stayed shut as though something was holding it. Panic set in. The windows were similarly unyielding. They were trapped. That's when the noises began. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed from the second floor, though no one was upstairs. The friends huddled together in the living room, whispering prayers and clutching each other tightly. Suddenly, the fireplace roared to life with flames that burned an unnatural blue. Shadows danced on the walls, growing longer and sharper until they seemed to reach out for the group. "Get to the basement!" Lucas shouted, his voice cracking. They ran down the narrow stairs, slamming the door shut behind them. The basement was damp and cold, with a faint smell of decay. In the corner stood an old, dust-covered chest. "What's in there?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could stop him, Lucas opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, showing different groups of people posing in front of the same house. The last photo in the stack was of them, taken that evening, though none of them remembered posing for it. Above them, the footsteps descended the stairs. The next morning, the house was quiet. A new listing appeared online that day. Charming historical home for rent, perfect for the holidays. When the footsteps reached the basement door, the friends froze, their breath visible in the icy air. The door handle turned slowly, creaking with the deliberate motion of someone or something on the other side. Lucas, holding an old rusted pipe he'd found on the floor, stepped in front of the group. "We can't just sit here. We have to find another way out," he whispered. The group scanned the basement for exits. Jake spotted a small, dirt-encrusted window near the ceiling. "We can break it and climb out," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with hope. Emma found a heavy wrench among the scattered tools and handed it to Jake. He swung it hard at the glass, but instead of shattering, the window absorbed the blow with a dull, unnatural thud. The group stared in disbelief. "What the hell is this place?" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. The basement door suddenly slammed open, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and a faint whispering sound filled the room. It wasn't coming from outside, it was all around them, the words unintelligible but heavy with menace. "Stay together," Lucas commanded, gripping the pipe tightly. The whispers grew louder, resolving into fragments of speech. "Leave. Time. Yet." "What does that mean?" Emma cried, clutching Sarah's arm. Jake stumbled back, his foot catching on the edge of the old chest they'd opened earlier. As he fell, the photographs spilled across the floor. One of them fluttered into the dim light, catching Emma's eye. It was the same picture of them from the night before, but now, the four friends were no longer smiling. Their faces were replaced with blank, shadowy voids. "This isn't real. This can't be real," Jake shouted, scrambling to his feet. The sound of heavy breathing filled the room, but it wasn't theirs. A figure began to form in the corner, a tall man with hollow eyes, wearing the same tattered coat Jake had described. His face was pale, almost translucent, and he pointed a long, bony finger at the group. "Get out," he hissed, his voice like nails scraping glass. Lucas didn't wait to ask questions. "The stairs. Now." They bolted past the figure, their fear propelling them faster than they thought possible. As they reached the top of the basement stairs, the front door stood wide open, letting in the pale light of dawn. "Run!" Sarah screamed. They didn't look back as they sprinted out into the snow, their shoes crunching against the frozen ground. Only when they reached the road did they dare to stop and turn around. The house stood silent, its dark windows reflecting the rising sun. There was no sign of the man or any movement inside. But as they caught their breath, the door creaked shut on its own. Later that day, the friends gathered in Lucas's apartment, too shaken to speak. It was Emma who finally broke the silence. We need to report this to someone. The police, the owner, anyone. Lucas hesitated. Report what? A haunted house? They'll think we're insane. Jake pulled out his phone, scrolling through the rental listing. But it was gone. The house no longer existed online. It's like it erased itself, Jake muttered. Sarah shivered. It didn't want us there, but why? What would have happened if we'd stayed? No one had an answer. All they knew was that they'd survived, but the experience left scars deeper than any of them could admit. A month later, Lucas received an email from an unfamiliar sender. The subject line read, "Thank you for visiting. Please leave a review." He deleted it without opening it, but the message stayed burned into his mind, a chilling reminder that the house hadn't forgotten them and maybe, someday, it would call them back. Lucas didn't sleep the night after receiving the email. The memories of the house haunted him, replaying in his mind like a broken record. But he didn't tell the others about the message. He didn't want to drag them back into the nightmare. Weeks turned into months. Life returned to normal, or so it seemed. Yet, little things began to go wrong for each of them. Emma's dreams were plagued by the sound of footsteps and whispers. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain that someone was in her apartment, though it was always empty. Sarah started seeing shadowy figures in the corners of her vision. She avoided mirrors entirely, convinced that her reflection wasn't always her own. Jake's phone would randomly flash with distorted photos of the house, despite his attempts to reset it. Once, he found a new picture, a group of strangers standing in front of the house, their faces eerily familiar but twisted into expressions of terror. Lucas, however, was the first to notice something worse. The four of them were disappearing from their own lives. Friends stopped returning calls. Professors didn't recognize them in class. One day, Lucas walked into his usual coffee shop, only for the barista to look at him like he was a stranger. "What's happening to us?" Sarah whispered during their next meeting, her hands trembling around a cup of untouched tea. "We're being erased," Lucas said quietly, staring at the table. "It's the house. It's not done with us." "Then we go back," Jake said suddenly. Emma stared at him in disbelief. "Go back? Are you insane? That place nearly killed us." Jake's jaw tightened. "If we don't, it will finish what it started. It wants us to come back." Despite their fear, the group knew Jake was right. They couldn't keep living like this, slowly vanishing from existence. On a cold, gray evening, they drove back to the house. It looked exactly as they'd left it, though now, it seemed even darker, more foreboding. The front door was unlocked, swinging open with a low groan. Inside, the house was colder than the winter air outside. The photographs were back on the walls, including the one of them, their faces now completely gone. A deep voice echoed through the house, low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come back." The friends stood frozen as the man in the coat appeared at the top of the staircase, his form flickering like a dying light. "What do you want from us?" Lucas shouted, his voice breaking. "You took what wasn't yours," the man replied. His bony finger pointed toward the old chest in the basement. They rushed downstairs, their steps echoing hollowly. The chest sat exactly where they'd left it, but it was no longer filled with photographs. Instead, inside were objects, small personal belongings. A locket, a pair of glasses, a child's toy. It's memories, Emma whispered, her hand trembling as she picked up a bracelet. These belonged to the others. The house feeds on them, Lucas realized, his voice a horrified whisper. It erases people and keeps their lives here. The voice roared again. Put them back. With shaking hands, the group returned the items to the chest. As they closed the lid, the house began to shudder violently. The whispers grew deafening, the air thick with an unearthly pressure. Run! Jake yelled, dragging Sarah toward the stairs. They barely made it outside before the house collapsed inward, folding into itself until nothing remained but a barren patch of snow. The road was eerily silent, as though the house had never existed. The group stood in the cold, gasping for breath. Do you think it's over? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Emma looked back at the empty clearing. I don't know. In the months that followed, their lives slowly returned to normal. People recognized them again, the shadows disappeared, and the nightmares faded. But none of them ever truly forgot the house or the man in the coat. Years later, Lucas stumbled upon a new online listing. Charming historical home for rent, perfect for the holidays. He closed his laptop immediately, but deep down, he knew someone else would soon walk through its doors. And the cycle would begin again. It was late December when 4 college friends, Mia, Ethan, Rachel, and Tom, decided to spend Christmas away from the city. Rachel had found a remote cabin online, nestled deep in the woods, perfect for a quiet holiday escape. This is exactly what we need, Rachel said as they packed the car. No distractions, no stress, just snow, hot cocoa, and good vibes. The cabin looked picturesque in the photos, and the reviews were glowing, though oddly vague. Nobody mentioned the location specifically, but Rachel brushed it off as a quirk of rural rentals. The drive took longer than expected. The main road was snowed over, forcing them to park and hike the last half-mile. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the dense forest was bathed in shadows. It was charming, just as the listing promised, a quaint wooden cabin with a steep, snow-covered roof and warm golden lights glowing from the windows. Inside, the air smelled of pine and cinnamon, as though someone had recently been there. Wow, this is cozy, Mia said, running her hands along the rustic furniture. They settled in quickly, lighting the fireplace and unpacking their food. The first night was peaceful, with laughter, board games, and wine. Snow fell steadily outside, blanketing the forest in silence. But the silence became unsettling as the night wore on. Around 2 a.m., Ethan, unable to sleep, heard faint noises outside, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. He peeked out the window but saw nothing. Probably an animal, he muttered to himself, climbing back into bed. The next morning, Tom went outside to chop firewood and froze mid-swing. "Guys, come here," he called, his voice uneasy. The others stepped out to find a set of footprints leading up to the cabin but not away from it. "Maybe it's one of ours from last night?" Mia suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. Ethan shook his head. "No way. These are fresh, and they're too big." They scanned the woods, but there was no sign of anyone. "Let's just stay inside," Rachel said, her voice trembling. That night, the unease grew. The fireplace crackled, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill that crept through the cabin. Around midnight, the noises returned, this time louder. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circled the cabin, pausing occasionally near the windows. "Who's out there?" Tom shouted, grabbing a flashlight and heading for the door. "Tom, wait," Rachel pleaded, but he was already outside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The others watched from the window as Tom scanned the tree-line. Suddenly, the light flickered, and Tom stumbled backward. "Tom!" Mia screamed, throwing the door open. He ran back inside, slamming the door behind him. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. "There's someone out there," he whispered. "Tall. Wearing. I don't know, something old. I couldn't see his face." "Call the police," Ethan said, fumbling for his phone. But there was no signal, and the Wi-Fi, which had worked earlier, was now offline. The four barricaded the doors and windows with whatever they could find, huddling in the living room as the footsteps continued outside. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, a loud thud came from the roof. "How did they get up there?" Mia whispered, clutching Rachel's arm. Ethan grabbed a poker from the fireplace, his hands shaking. "We need to make a run for it." "Back to the car." "What if they're waiting for us in the woods?" Rachel argued. Before they could decide, a piece of paper slid under the front door. Ethan hesitated, then picked it up. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "Stay inside. Don't look for us." "Who's US?" Mia asked, her voice barely audible. A second paper slid under the door. This one read, "We didn't listen. Now we're here forever." Rachel gasped, her eyes wide. "This has to be a joke. Someone's messing with us." But Tom shook his head. "It's not a joke. Whoever wrote this, they know the cabin." As dawn approached, the noises stopped, and the forest was eerily still. They ventured outside cautiously, finding no footprints except for the ones they'd made the day before. Relieved but shaken, they hiked back to their car. Yet when they reached the clearing where they'd parked, the car was gone. No tire tracks, no sign it had ever been there. "What's happening to us?" Rachel whispered. Before anyone could answer, they heard a voice behind them, faint but clear. "You shouldn't have left." They turned, but the forest was empty. The voice sent chills down their spines. The friends stood frozen, scanning the forest, but it was completely still. No wind. No animals. Just silence. "Let's go back to the cabin," Ethan said reluctantly. "It's better than wandering aimlessly." Rachel hesitated. "Are you insane?" "We barely escaped that place." "Then where do you want to go?" "There's no car, no signal, and it's freezing," Ethan snapped, his breath visible in the icy air. Tom nodded, his jaw tight. "He's right. We need shelter until we figure this out." Defeated, the group trudged back to the cabin, the snow crunching under their boots. When they arrived, the door was slightly ajar. "Didn't we lock it?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. "We did," Tom replied grimly, stepping inside first. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it except for one thing. A fresh set of footprints, leading from the door to the fireplace, then disappearing. "What the hell?" Rachel whispered. "Whoever it is, they're toying with us," Tom said, gripping the fire poker tightly. The group sat in uneasy silence, too afraid to sleep. The hours crawled by. Then, just before dawn, the fireplace flared up, the flames turning a deep green. The friends scrambled back as a figure materialized in the flickering light. It was the man Tom had seen outside, tall, gaunt figure dressed in tattered old-fashioned clothing. His face was obscured by shadow, but his voice was clear. "You didn't listen." "We don't know what you want," Ethan shouted. The man tilted his head, as though studying them. "You were warned to stay inside. You left. Now you've been marked." "Marked for what?" Rachel demanded, tears streaming down her face. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the old wooden table in the center of the room. Carved into the surface were 4 symbols, each one glowing faintly. "Your lives are tied to this place now," the man said. "You'll never leave unless you break the bond." "How do we do that?" Mia asked, desperation in her voice. The man faded into the shadows, leaving only his chilling words, "Find what binds you here or lose yourselves entirely." As the morning sun rose, the group examined the table. Each symbol seemed to correspond to one of them: a book for Rachel, a snowflake for Mia, a hammer for Tom, and a flame for Ethan. "These must mean something," Rachel said, tracing the carvings with her finger. "Maybe it's what brought us here," Mia suggested. "Why did we even come to this cabin in the first place?" The group fell silent, realizing they'd never questioned Rachel's choice. "It was the reviews," Rachel said hesitantly. "Everyone said it was perfect, and it just felt right." Ethan frowned. "But who wrote the reviews?" "You said they were vague." Rachel paled. "I didn't think about that." Tom stood abruptly. "We need to search the cabin. There has to be something here that explains this." They split up, scouring every corner. Mia found an old journal in a drawer, its pages filled with cryptic entries. "They came. They stayed. They couldn't leave." Ethan discovered a hidden compartment under the floorboards containing personal items: a locket, a pair of boots, and a photograph of a different group of 4, their faces blurred beyond recognition. "They were like us," Ethan muttered, holding up the photo. Meanwhile, Rachel uncovered a map of the forest etched into the back of a cabinet. A red X marked a spot not far from the cabin. "We have to go there," she said, showing the map to the others. Tom hesitated. "What if it's a trap?" "What choice do we have?" Rachel countered. The friends set out at midday, the sun offering little warmth. The forest grew denser as they followed the map, the trees looming like silent sentinels. When they reached the marked spot, they found an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and surrounded by withered flowers. Carved into the stone were the same symbols as on the table in the cabin. In the center was a shallow bowl filled with ash. "What now?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the photo of the blurred group. "They must have done this too. Maybe we have to burn something that represents us." The group exchanged uneasy glances. One by one, they placed personal items into the bowl: Rachel's notebook, Mia's scarf, Tom's multi-tool, and Ethan's lighter. As the last item landed, the ash ignited, flames roaring to life. The air grew heavy, and the ground shook beneath their feet. A voice echoed through the forest, deep and resonant. "The bond is severed. You are free." The fire died as quickly as it had started, leaving the bowl empty. "Did it work?" Mia asked, her breath hitching. "We'll find out," Tom replied, turning back toward the cabin. When they returned, the cabin was gone, replaced by an untouched patch of snow. Their car was back at the road, its windows frosted but intact. The friends climbed in without a word, driving in silence until the cabin and the forest were far behind them. None of them ever spoke of what happened. But every year on Christmas Eve, they each woke to the same dream: a cabin in the woods, its door slightly ajar, waiting for the next group to arrive. Years passed, and the memory of the cabin faded into the background of their lives. Rachel, Ethan, Mia, and Tom each moved on, but they could never completely shake the unease that had settled deep within them. Every Christmas Eve, they were haunted by the same vivid dream: the cabin standing in the snow, its door slightly ajar, beckoning them back. By the 10th year, they had all but convinced themselves it was a trick of their minds, an overactive imagination sparked by a traumatic experience. But on Christmas Eve that year, something changed. Each of them woke to find an identical envelope on their doorstep. Inside was a single piece of parchment, the words written in the same shaky hand as the notes from the cabin. "The bond is not broken. Return, or the forest will come to you." Ethan called Rachel immediately. "Did you get it too?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. Within hours, all 4 friends were on a conference call. "This can't be real," Mia said. "We burned those items. The bond was supposed to be severed." "Maybe we missed something," Tom said grimly. "Or maybe it was never meant to end." "What does it mean, the forest will come to you?" Rachel asked. Ethan sighed. "I don't think we want to find out." Despite their fear, they decided to meet and return to the woods. They had to know the truth. They arrived at the edge of the forest as the sun set. Snow covered the ground, and a biting wind howled through the trees. As they ventured deeper, the landscape seemed unnaturally familiar, though none of them had been there in a decade. And then, it appeared, the cabin, just as it had been before. The same steep roof, the same golden lights glowing in the windows. "How is this possible?" Mia whispered. The door creaked open as they approached, inviting them inside. "Do we go in?" Ethan asked, gripping the flashlight tightly. Rachel stepped forward. "We don't have a choice." Inside, the cabin was exactly as they remembered, down to the table with the glowing symbols. This time, however, there was something new. 4 small wooden figurines, each carved in their likeness, standing on the table. "What is this?" Tom muttered, picking up his figure. As soon as he touched it, the cabin trembled, and a low, guttural voice filled the air. "You returned, but you cannot leave again." The fireplace roared to life, and the door slammed shut behind them. The symbols on the table began to glow brighter, pulsating with an unnatural energy. "We broke the bond," Rachel shouted. "We did what you asked." The voice replied, cold and unyielding, "You severed the bond to this place, but not to me. The forest claims all who enter. Your escape was temporary. Now you belong." The figurines began to crack, and with each break, the friends felt a sharp pain, as though pieces of their souls were being torn away. "No!" Mia cried, grabbing her figurine and throwing it into the fire. The flames consumed it instantly, and Mia collapsed, her body fading into nothingness. "Mia!" Rachel screamed, but it was too late. "We have to destroy them," Ethan yelled, tossing his figurine into the fire. He too vanished, leaving only a faint echo of his scream. Tom and Rachel hesitated, staring at the 2 remaining figurines. "Maybe there's another way," Rachel said desperately. But the cabin began to collapse around them, the walls splintering as the forest seemed to close in. Tom grabbed his figurine, looking at Rachel with determination. "If we don't, it'll take us anyway." With a heavy heart, he threw his figure into the fire. Rachel was alone now. The walls of the cabin were gone, replaced by endless trees. She held her figurine tightly, tears streaming down her face. The voice spoke again, softer this time. "Choose. Burn it, and you'll join them. Keep it, and stay with me." Rachel stared at the figure, her hands trembling. The forest loomed closer, the shadows growing darker. Taking a deep breath, she hurled the figurine into the flames. The fire roared, and Rachel felt herself fading, her body dissolving into the cold air. When the forest grew quiet, there was nothing left but the cabin, standing as it always had, waiting for its next visitors. And in the firelight, 4 new figurines stood on the table, their expressions frozen in silent despair. It was the first week of December when Lily, Jake, Max, and Olivia decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods for a much-needed winter getaway. They had known each other since college, and this was their chance to unwind before the holiday season kicked into full gear. The cabin was located at Pine Hollow, a remote area known for its breathtaking winter landscapes and peaceful surroundings. The drive up was beautiful, with snowflakes falling gently, covering the roads and trees in a soft, white blanket. It felt like the perfect escape. When they arrived, the cabin appeared to be straight out of a postcard, a rustic wooden structure with a stone fireplace, surrounded by towering pine trees and a winding stream nearby. They were excited to settle in for a long weekend of hot cocoa, board games, and relaxation. "This place is perfect," Jake said, stepping inside and glancing around. Lily, who had always been the planner of the group, had researched the cabin beforehand. "It's completely off the grid, so no distractions, no phone signal, just us and the nature around us." The first night. The first evening went smoothly. They cooked dinner together, laughed around the fire, and exchanged holiday gifts. Afterward, they sat in front of the fire, enjoying the quiet. As the evening drew to a close, they each retired to their respective rooms. But around 2 a.m., Lily was awoken by a sound she couldn't place. It was a low, rhythmic thumping like someone was knocking on the door. She sat up in bed, listening intently. The sound came again, louder this time. It was followed by the faintest whisper, too soft to understand. Lily's heart started racing. Probably just the wind, she told herself, but the unease wouldn't go away. She grabbed her phone to check the time but found there was no signal, not even a bar. The entire cabin seemed to hum with a strange energy, but she tried to brush it off as just her imagination. The next morning, she mentioned the sound to the others, but they all dismissed it as a dream or the wind. "Are you sure you weren't just hearing things?" Max asked, sipping his coffee. "I don't know. It felt real," she replied, but the others weren't convinced. They were all too eager to enjoy their vacation to let something as trivial as a strange sound ruin their fun. The unsettling discoveries. The second day passed without incident. They went for a hike in the forest, took pictures by the frozen stream, and spent time reading and relaxing. But that evening, things started to get stranger. After dinner, Olivia went upstairs to use the bathroom. She returned pale, her eyes wide. "You guys, you need to see this." Curious, the group followed her upstairs. In the hallway, there was a small wooden door they hadn't noticed before. It led to an attic space, one that seemed too small and dusty to be of much interest. But what struck them was the old, handwritten note pinned to the door. "Do not enter. The house remembers." Max raised an eyebrow. "That's ominous. But who would leave something like this?" Jake went to open the door, but Olivia stopped him. "Maybe we should just leave it alone." Despite the tension in the air, the group shrugged it off. They spent the rest of the evening playing cards in the living room, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The haunting begins. That night, the knocking returned. But this time, it wasn't just on the door. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was louder, more insistent, and accompanied by the same whispers that had unsettled Lily the previous night. "Okay, I'm starting to get freaked out," Jake said, his voice shaky. "There's something wrong with this place." Lily agreed, and they decided to check the attic. They couldn't ignore it any longer. With a flashlight in hand, Max opened the attic door. The air inside was thick with dust, and there was a musty smell. The floor creaked under their weight as they stepped inside, their footsteps echoing off the wooden beams. At first, they saw nothing unusual. But as they moved deeper into the attic, they stumbled upon something chilling: a row of old photographs, yellowed with age. They showed previous occupants of the cabin, families and friends posing together, but their faces were scratched out. "That's disturbing," Olivia whispered. Lily's hand hovered over one of the pictures. Why would someone scratch out their faces? As they turned to leave, something caught Max's eye. In the corner of the attic was a small wooden chest. It was locked, but the key sat next to it, as though inviting them to open it. "I think we should leave it alone," Olivia said, her voice trembling. But Jake, ever the curious one, picked up the key and unlocked the chest. Inside was a collection of old trinkets, rings, necklaces, and a small journal. Lily picked up the journal. The pages were filled with frantic handwriting, describing strange happenings, objects moving on their own, whispers at night, and a growing sense of dread. The last entry read, "It's too late. The house will take what it wants." The terror unleashed. The group quickly put everything back and hurried out of the attic, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. The air was heavy with a sense of impending danger. The whispers became louder, more distinct, and they were coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the ceiling all seemed to breathe with an unnatural pulse. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, and the knocking resumed, louder than ever. The whispers filled the room. "We need to get out of here," Max said, his voice rising with panic. But when they reached the front door, it wouldn't open. It was as if something was holding it shut. "Try the windows," Jake shouted. They all rushed to the windows, but they were locked tight, as though something was preventing them from leaving. Then, the front door creaked open, slowly, as though inviting them in. The knocking stopped, and the whispers faded into a haunting silence. The final choice. Standing at the threshold of the door, the friends faced a decision. Go into the forest, where they knew they could get lost in the snow, or step into whatever awaited them in the dark, open doorway of the cabin. "Whatever happens, we stay together," Lily said, trying to hold back her fear. But the door didn't remain open for long. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment, they saw something, a figure, barely visible, standing at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, and its features were blurry, like a shadow moving against the light. "Get out! Now!" Olivia screamed, shoving past the others. They bolted out the door and into the snow, running into the night. Behind them, the cabin loomed, dark and silent, as though it had never been alive to begin with. To be continued. Though they escaped that night, none of them could shake the feeling that the cabin at Pine Hollow was not finished with them yet. They had left, but the whispers still followed them, whispers that warned them to return. The cabin had taken so much more than they realized. And now, they were connected to it in ways they couldn't comprehend. The return to Pine Hollow. It had been 6 months since Lily, Jake, Max, and Olivia had escaped the cabin at Pine Hollow. The snow had melted, the trees had regained their green hue, and the air was warmer. But something inside them had never quite settled. They had all tried to move on, but the whispers, the figures in the darkness, the things they'd seen in that cursed cabinet haunted them. Lily was the first to break. She called the group one evening, her voice strained. "I've been thinking about it a lot. We can't just leave it like this. We need to go back." Jake was the first to protest. "Are you crazy? After everything that happened? We can't go back there. It's over." "I don't think it is," Lily replied, her tone heavy. "The cabin. It's still connected to us. I've been having dreams where I'm back there." The whispers won't stop. Max and Olivia were hesitant, but the thought gnawed at them. The unresolved terror, the unanswered questions. "What if it's not over?" Olivia asked quietly. "What if the house, or whatever it is, wants something else?" After days of deliberation, the group reluctantly agreed. They would return to Pine Hollow. But this time, they would go prepared. They'd learned nothing could be trusted, not the house, nor the forest, nor the strange forces that lurked within. Back to the cabin. The drive felt different this time. It wasn't the thrill of a new adventure, but the weight of dread hanging in the air. The roads that had once been so beautiful now felt suffocating, like they were being pulled toward something dark and inevitable. The further they drove, the colder the air became, and soon the snow was falling again, thick and fast. When they arrived at the cabin, it was just as they had left it, silent, still, and empty, the door slightly ajar. Nothing about it seemed different, but there was an overwhelming sense that something inside was waiting. "We shouldn't go in," Max said, his voice shaking. But despite the fear, they stepped inside, as though some invisible force was pulling them forward. The air was thick with dust. The faint scent of decay lingered. The fire in the fireplace had long since gone cold, but in the silence, they could still hear the faint sound of something scratching against the wood. The door to the attic, once closed and locked, now stood wide open. The heart of the mystery. "We need to get to the attic," Jake said, his voice low but determined. "It's where we found everything last time. It's where the answers are." But as they made their way up the creaky stairs, the whispers started again, soft at first, then louder, as though they were coming from within the walls themselves. Lily was the first to reach the attic door. She hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The attic was darker than before, the shadows more oppressive. The trinkets they had found earlier were still there, scattered across the floor, but now there was something else, an old, worn chair in the center of the room, facing away from them. As they entered, the chair slowly turned on its own. A figure sat there, cloaked in darkness. But it wasn't human, at least not anymore. It had the shape of a man, but its features were distorted. Blurred its face was a hollow mask of deep, ancient sorrow. The whispers seemed to emanate from it. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure rasped, its voice a hollow echo of something long lost. Lily's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" "I am the one who waits," it replied, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "I was once a guardian, but the house, this place, has consumed me. And now, it feeds on you." Max backed away, his eyes wide with terror. "No. We didn't do anything to deserve this." The figure's empty eyes fixed on them, and it began to move, slowly, in jerking motions. "You took the trinkets. You listened to the whispers. You disturbed the ritual." "Ritual?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. "The ritual to protect those who came before," the figure croaked. "The cabin has a price. It never forgets, and it never lets go." Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The whispers grew louder, until they were almost deafening. The walls began to close in, and the air grew thick with a sense of overwhelming dread. "We need to finish what they started," the figure said, its voice breaking through the noise. "Or else." Before they could react, the world around them seemed to warp. The cabin, the walls, the attic, all of it began to distort, like they were being pulled into a different realm altogether. The choice. Suddenly, the space seemed to stretch and twist, and before them appeared a large, ancient book. The cover was etched with strange symbols, and as they approached, the whispers grew frenzied. Lily reached for the book, and as her fingers touched it, a voice thundered in her mind. "You must choose." The pages of the book opened to a faded ritual. The text was indecipherable, but it was clear that it involved sacrificing something precious. But what? And to whom? "Do we finish the ritual?" Lily asked, staring at the others. "Are you serious?" Max shouted. "We don't know what this is. This could be what keeps the house alive." But Olivia was already reading the text aloud, her voice trembling as she whispered the ancient words. The air in the attic began to crackle with energy, and the figure in the chair moved again, its head tilting unnaturally. "It's too late now," the figure hissed. "The house has chosen." Suddenly, the floor beneath them cracked open, revealing an abyss below them. Shadows stirred in the darkness, and something massive, dark, and ancient began to rise from the depths. To be continued. As the shadows reached out to claim them, the group had only one choice: face whatever waited in the depths or risk being consumed by the house forever. The whispers were no longer distant, they were inside their minds, their thoughts, and their very souls. And as the cabin creaked and groaned around them, they realized the real question was no longer if they would escape, but how they could ever leave at all. The darkness beneath the floor roared to life, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. The figure in the chair was no longer just a shadow, it was something far older, something far more dangerous. The whispers had merged into a cacophony, tearing at their minds, urging them to act, to make a choice. Lily's heart pounded as she gripped the ancient book in her hands, feeling the heat of its cursed power radiate through her fingers. She could sense that whatever she did next would seal their fate. "What are we supposed to do?" Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible against the screams of the shadows. The air grew heavier, the space around them bending and warping. The figure in the chair stood now, its form shifting and rippling like smoke. It raised its skeletal hand toward them, a final warning. "You must finish it. Only then will the house release you," the figure rasped, its voice hollow, like the wind through dry bones. "But remember, not all sacrifices are what they seem." Max stepped forward, his face pale with fear. "We can't. We can't make a sacrifice. Not after everything we've been through. This thing, it's manipulating us." Lily was shaking, torn between the weight of the book in her hands and the horrifying reality that they might not escape this place. The shadows were drawing closer, their cold fingers brushing the edges of her consciousness. There was only one thing left to do. She glanced at her friends, then at the book. There was no other way. They had to finish what had been started, or they would never leave Pine Hollow. But the question remained, what exactly would they have to give? The words in the book swirled before her eyes, no longer foreign. There was a price, one they hadn't understood before. The sacrifice was not just physical, but spiritual. They had to offer something precious, something of themselves. It wasn't just a material object or a life. It was their very essence, something they would never get back. Lily took a deep breath and began to read aloud the final incantation. The air around them seemed to ripple, as though the very fabric of reality was thinning. As she spoke the final words, the shadows recoiled, and the air grew thick with an oppressive silence. For a moment, everything was still. The figure in the chair, now completely transparent, let out a low, mournful sigh. "You have chosen," it whispered. "The price." The world seemed to fall away, and the cabin itself trembled. Lily, Jake, Max, and Olivia felt as though they were being pulled into the ground, sinking into the very heart of Pine Hollow. The shadows surrounded them, but they no longer had form. They were nothing but echoes of a past they could never fully understand. Lily felt a sharp pain in her chest, an unbearable weight. She realized, too late, that the sacrifice they had made wasn't just physical. The house had taken something from each of the memories, moments, and parts of their very souls. When they opened their eyes again, they were no longer in the attic. The cabin had vanished, and they were standing outside, in the snow. The air was cold, the sky overcast, and the forest was silent. The house was gone. But something had changed in them. Something was missing, like a piece of their lives had been erased. They couldn't remember how they had gotten outside, or how much time had passed. But they knew that the house would never let go of its claim over them. They had paid the price, and it was one they would never fully understand. The end. Or was it? As they walked back to the car, the road ahead seemed endless, stretching out before them like a dark ribbon. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Lily's hand reached for her phone, but there was still no signal. The others did the same, their faces grim, each feeling the emptiness inside them that the cabin had left behind. Just as they reached the edge of the woods, a faint sound drifted toward them on the wind. It was a whisper, so soft that they almost didn't hear it. "You are not free." They turned, but the forest was silent. And then, Lily felt something strange. A cold breath against her neck, like fingers running through her hair. She turned again, but there was nothing. The whispers were there, just out of reach, reminding them that the cabin Pine Hollow was still part of them, and that its influence would never truly end. The road ahead might be clear, but the shadow of the house would follow them, forevermore.